Hello and welcome. I'm John O'Hayes and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. And these are our top stories. President Trump says the Gaza ceasefire remains in place. That's despite recent strikes as Witkoff and Kushner arrive in Israel. 8 priceless jewels are stolen from the Louvre Museum as police continue to hunt down the culprits and to recover the artefacts. And the Epstein victims speaking out from beyond the grave. Virginia Giuffre's memoirs are revealed, detailing damning allegations against Prince Andrew. US President Donald Trump says a ceasefire in Gaza is still in place. That's despite Israeli military strikes against Hamas over the weekend. The IDF have accused Hamas of breaching the deal after 2 soldiers were killed in Rafah. Meanwhile, Hamas say they're committed to the ceasefire. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, have travelled to Israel today to meet with members of Netanyahu's government. Here's a reminder of what President Trump told reporters on board Air Force One.
We want to make sure that it's going to be very peaceful with Hamas. And as you know, they've been quite rambunctious. They've been doing some shooting, and we think maybe the leadership isn't involved in that. You know, some rebels within. But either way, it's going to be handled properly. It's going to be handled toughly, but properly.
Is the ceasefire still in place?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Now, for more on this, I'm joined by Asher Fredman, who is a former Israeli strategic affairs official and the executive director of Misgav Institute for National Security. Asher, thanks for joining us. First of all, from your perspective, how fragile is this ceasefire deal right now? Are we really looking at a lasting truce, or is this just a pause in the fighting?
Thank you for having me, and good evening. Israel is committed to the ceasefire. That's why after responding to Hamas's attacks against Israel's soldiers, they restored the ceasefire and ceased the attacks. But remember, the first point in Trump's 20-point plan is Gaza will be a de-radicalized, terror-free zone. And we've seen over the last few days how Hamas has restored its rule over the parts of Gaza that Israel is no longer in, how it's executed in broad daylight dozens of Gazans, and how it's returned to the streets carrying its weapons. Israel remains committed to the ceasefire, but I would agree with your assessment that it is indeed fragile.
Both sides are accusing each other at the moment of these violations. Who's got the leverage right now, though, in maintaining that calm on the ground that's also important?
Israel, in accordance with the ceasefire, retreated to what's known as the yellow line, which President Trump and his team drew on the map of Gaza. And Israel made very clear, we are going to withdraw. We will no longer be present in the areas where we have withdrawn. We will not act militarily in those areas. But any attempt by Hamas to attack our soldiers on that line will be met with a military response. And that's exactly what Israel has done. But the bigger question, I think, really goes to the heart of what's happening here is Hamas going to be demilitarized? Who's going to demilitarize Hamas? Are Saudi soldiers, Emirati soldiers, Qatari soldiers, Turkish soldiers, Indonesian soldiers really going to go in and take away Hamas's weapons? Is Hamas going to just decide to hand over its RPGs and its Kalashnikov rifles? Obviously, we don't want U.S. boots on the ground. So who is really going to demilitarize Hamas? I think that's the most important question right now.
Well, look, we know that the US are heading there. And what role do you think the envoy from the US, so like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, what are they going to play in stabilizing this very, very fragile situation right now?
We have to look at, first of all, we have to be thankful, express deep gratitude to both Witkoff and Kushner for bringing about the release of the 20 living hostages, some of the dead hostages, although Hamas is still holding some of the bodies. And now they're trying to keep, understandably and correctly, trying to maintain the ceasefire. One of the things that led to the successful outcome of the first stage of the deal was when they put pressure on Qatar. And they told Qatar, you need to bring Hamas to the table and you need to get Hamas to agree to the first stage of the deal. And lo and behold, when that pressure was put on, Qatar was able to deliver Hamas. If they truly want to get to a stage where Hamas demilitarizes, gives up its weapons, one key strategy is going to put real pressure on Qatar, for them to put real pressure on their Hamas allies or Hamas partners.
Let's talk about the humanitarian crisis. We're hearing a lot about this in the last couple of days, once again in Gaza. What is the immediate priority for aid agencies? So what have Israel actually allowed in that we know of in terms of aid?
So Israel initially, again, in accordance with the agreement, allowed in hundreds of trucks of aid, and that aid continues to come into the Strip. It was restricted during the fighting. It was also restricted to a degree due to the fact that Hamas is not keeping its part of the agreement in terms of not returning the bodies of murdered hostages, which it holds or which it knows about their location. There's some it doesn't know, and there's somewhere it does know of their location, but it's still refusing to return them to Israel. But in general, Israel is not opposed in any way to aid reaching Gazan civilians. The problem is when this aid reaches Hamas, and food is one thing, fuel is another, cement, heavy equipment. There's a real fear that cement reconstruction materials that enter the Gaza Strip will be used by Hamas to rebuild its military infrastructure, to rebuild its capability to attack Israel once again. And that's a very complicated issue that Israel, the United States, and the other mediators need to work out in order to ensure that Gaza does not become once again a threat to Israel.
The feeling on the ground in Gaza right now is that Hamas are trying to get those victims back. And as you said, you don't believe that they know the location of those, that they do know the location of those victims. They're just simply not returning them. Yeah. My question is, what is the feeling on the ground from Israel? Do they feel like at least some headway has been made in returning the bodies of these hostages?
Well, I mean, we can look at the facts. The 20 living hostages are home, and that was a moment of great joy, great national joy. And Israel's been very happy that a number of the murdered hostages have been returned. 16 are staying in Gaza. And again, our best assessment, I don't know the intelligence, but our best assessment is that some of them, Hamas does know where they are and could return them on their own. And some of them it doesn't. And there's that mechanism that is supposed to allow coordination for that. But Israel's demand right now is that Hamas, according to what it agreed to in its conversations with the United States, the other mediators, immediately return all of the bodies that it knows where they are so they can be brought for a proper burial here in Israel.
Asher, my question is, what do Hamas actually have to gain by withholding the bodies of deceased hostages? What benefit could it possibly, what leverage could it possibly give to Hamas at this point when Hamas are the ones who are saying that they are willing to go to the table and they are trying to keep to their end of the bargain, but it's simply not possible?
Hamas's goal is to reestablish its control over the Gaza Strip. Hamas has no real intention of giving up control, of giving up its arms. It may allow for some sort of technocratic government to, be in charge of garbage collection or of delivering the mail, but Hamas fully intends to remain the dominant, controlling power in the Gaza Strip and to rebuild its military capabilities. And to that end, it's going to play all kinds of games and tell all kinds of stories and do whatever it can to string out the implementation of the various stages and to see what it can, further concessions that it can extract. For example, Hamas would very much like large amounts of heavy equipment to enter the Gaza Strip. Why? So that it can use those bulldozers, presumably to look for hostage bodies, but also to rebuild its tunnels, to rebuild its warehouses, to rebuild its terror infrastructure. So it has a strong incentive to withhold the bodies in order to have the heavy machinery come in, which it can use for all kinds of purposes, including for its terror purposes as well.
Let's talk about the signs that we'll be watching out for in this somewhat of a ceasefire at the moment. What are we watching out for here to find out if this ceasefire is going to hold or if it's about to truly unravel?
The first stage of the ceasefire, or at least to a large part the first stage, as you mentioned, the release of the living hostages, Israel's withdrawal to the blue yellow line has happened. And now the next stage is supposed to happen. And the most critical element of the next stage is quite complex. You have a stabilization force and a technocratic government and a board of peace, but none of that will happen if Hamas does not disarm. As long as Hamas remains the dominant military power, then again, do we really think I would not, as an Israeli, I would not want to see not American troops, not Saudi troops, not Indonesian troops entering Gaza and clashing with Hamas in order to remove their arms. I think that's highly unlikely to happen. So the real question is Hamas going to lay down its arms? Are the leaders are they going to, renounce terror and accept peace? Are those who don't want to do that, are they going to leave Gaza? I'm skeptical. On the other hand, to be fair, President Trump, Mr. Kushner, Mr. Witkoff, Special Envoy Witkoff, did, against all expectations, deliver the first stage of the hostage deal. And I think that Israel should continue to remain as committed as possible to the hostage deal, and let us see whether or not progress can be made on Hamas disarming itself. That remains to be seen.
You mentioned a bit, Asher, about a military force on the ground, but I suppose the closest thing we have currently from an international perspective is President Trump's convoy, an envoy who are there, Witkoff and Kushner, who are currently involved. Their presence there, is that actually going to hold any diplomatic weight, or is it somewhat of a symbolic gesture?
No, I think that Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner have shown their ability to work with the leaders of the region to get really to I think to make to achieve the impossible but the realistic. I think their presence is important. I think that on the Israeli side, it's critical to present to them the real I would say the motivations or the intent of Hamas. I think that we've seen in a few cases that excuses that Hamas has made were adopted. I think that's problematic. Again, it remains to be seen, but Hamas, as we remember, is a Muslim Brotherhood, highly ideological, extremist terror organization whose basic constitution calls for the destruction of Israel. That has no qualms, not about killing Israeli babies and not about shooting Gazan children in broad daylight if it thinks it threatens their power. Will Hamas change? I don't know, but I definitely think that the Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff's presence here reflects President Trump's deep commitment to doing whatever he can, whatever the U.S. administration can do to, on the one hand, advance this 20-point agreement, and also to, as President Trump has made clear, ensure that Israel's security is protected.
Asher, as you and I sit here and back and forth about this, you have to remember that on the ground there is the rising civilian death toll. How are ordinary Israelis viewing this ceasefire right now? Is there broad public support for it still, like we saw in week one?
I do think there is broad public support. Obviously, the fact that 2 of our soldiers were killed by Hamas is leading to some people to call for a more robust response. I think Israelis are also asking themselves, why is the international media not covering the fact that Hamas, with the international media that counted every Gazan that was killed in the course of the war by Israel, seems to be for a large part ignoring the dozens of Gazans that are being executed in broad daylight, in cold blood by Hamas. And that doesn't seem to interest, no Jews, no news. That doesn't seem to be particularly interesting to the international community, international media. But overall, Israelis are, again, deeply grateful to President Trump for his strong support for Israel, for the release of the 20 living hostages. And Israelis deeply, deeply want to see every single one of the murdered hostages returned. And I think that there is going to be strong support for that ceasefire as long as we see progress on that front, hopefully as quickly as possible.
Asher Fredman, there we must leave it, former Israeli Strategic Affairs official and also Executive Director at the Misgav Institute for National Security. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the other stories that are making the headlines today.